Ray Dalio, yes, Ray Dalio finally posted to his YouTube channel for the first time in many, many months. And he posted a video here, and I was going to watch it by myself, and I said, let's just watch it together. Let me give my 2 cents on this as we watch this. I'm sure it should be good stuff. Apparently, a lot of people have watched this video so far. 3.6 million views. Holy smokers, this ain't no jokers. Ray Dalio net worth $20 billion. I think he might be the new top YouTuber in the finance category. So let's jump into this, guys. I'll give you my 2 cents. Hope you enjoy this as always. And I'm excited to watch this because I haven't seen it yet. And let's go into it.
The times ahead will be radically different from those that we've experienced in our lifetimes, though similar to many times before. How do I know that? Because they always have been.
I love the illustrations, man. That's just too good. I need to step up my game like this. It's just beautiful.
Over my roughly 50 years of global macroeconomic investing, I've learned the hard way that the most important events that surprised me did so because they never happened in my lifetime. These painful surprises led me to study the last 500 years of history for similar situations, where I saw that they had indeed happened many times before, with the ups and the downs of the Dutch, British, and U.S. empires.
Like watching a movie.
And every time they did, it was a sign of the changing world order. This study taught me valuable lessons that I'm going to pass along to you here in a distilled form. You can find the comprehensive version in my book, Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order.
Book? Ray Dalio. Why do you think we're watching this video right now? We don't believe in books, okay? Videos only. Videos only.
Let me begin with a story that brought me to this point, about how I learned to anticipate the future by studying the past. In 1971, when I was a young clerk on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, the United States ran out of money and defaulted on its debts. That's right, the U.S. ran out of money. How? Well, back then, gold was the money used in transactions between countries. Paper money, like the dollar, was like checks in a checkbook in that it had no value other than it could be exchanged for gold, which was the real money. At the time, the United States was spending a lot more money than it was earning by writing a lot more of these paper money checks than it had gold in the bank to exchange for them. As people turned these checks into the bank for gold money, the amount of gold in the U.S. started to dwindle. It soon became obvious that the U.S. couldn't keep its promises for all the existing paper money, so people holding dollars rushed to exchange them before the gold ran out. Recognizing that the U.S. was going to run out of real money, on Sunday evening, August 15th, President Nixon went on television to tell the world that the U.S. was breaking its promise to let people exchange their dollars for gold. Of course, he didn't say it that way. He said it more diplomatically, without making it clear that the United States was defaulting.
The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
I watched in awe, realizing that money as we understood it was ending. What a crisis.
A lot of people were not happy at that time, man. But if you were in that situation, what would you have done? You know, I would love to hear from that. You know, some people complain about it, but it's like, what would you have done in that situation? Would we have been better off if we kept things the way they were. That, I don't know about that. That's all.
I expected the stock market to plunge the next day, so I got on the exchange floor early to prepare. When the opening bell rang, pandemonium broke out, but not the kind I expected. The market was up, way up, and went on to rise nearly 25%. That surprised me because I never experienced a currency devaluation before. When I
25%. See, and by the way, this is another reason why, a lot of times you think certain things are going to play out certain ways, and they still don't in the stock market. And that's one of the most frustrating things in the stock market is you try to justify why this is happening or whatnot. Ray Dalio, somebody that today is worth $20 billion. He was convinced that stocks were about to tank on that day, right? You were like, oh man, I got to get up early. I got to get down there. The stocks are going to tank. And then they didn't go up. They went up. I don't know if I heard him right. I think he said 25%. That sounds a little ridiculous. That couldn't have been in one day. It must have been over several days.
Into history, I discovered that the exact same thing happened in 1933 and had the exact same effect. Then paper dollars were also linked to gold, which the U.S. was running out of because it was spending more paper money checks than it had gold to exchange for them. And President Roosevelt announced on the radio that he would break the country's promise to exchange dollars for gold.
It was then that I issued the proclamation providing for the National Bank holiday. And this was the first step in the government's reconstruction of our financial and economic fabric. The second step, last Thursday...
I like how Ray Dalio had that picture in there of those people just, sitting around the radio. Because that was literally what people did back in the day. Like, that was like the huge deal before smartphones and televisions and everything. Like, you waited around the radio for like something to happen. Like, whoa, what are they going to say here? Oh, man, those were the days. I wasn't around.
Legislation promptly and patriotically passed by the Congress, confirming my proclamation and broadening my powers so that it became possible, in view of the requirement of time, to extend the holiday and lift the ban of that holiday gradually in the days to come. This law also gave authority to develop a program for facilitation.
In both cases,
1933. I was trying to see the date.
The link to gold allowed the U.S. to continue spending more than it earned, simply by printing more paper dollars. Since there was an increase in the number of dollars without an increase in the country's wealth, the value of each dollar fell. As these new dollars entered the market, without a corresponding increase in productivity, they went to buy lots of stocks, gold, and commodities, and hence caused their prices to rise. As I studied more history, I saw that the exact same thing happened many, many times before. I saw that since the beginning of time, when governments spent much more than they took in taxes, and conditions got bad, they ran out of money and they needed more. So they printed more, a lot more, which made its value fall and made the prices of most everything, including stocks, gold, and commodities, rise.
Now, to be fair, to push back on this for a moment here, there's a finite amount of gold, right? There's a finite amount of gold, and even if you mine all the gold in the world, right, which there's a finite amount out there, you mine it all, okay? Then your economic system is you can't expand past that gold essentially at the end of the day, right? And so, if we talk about our economic system, which is set up much on debt, right? People taking out loans, those sorts of things, investing their paper money into stocks or bonds or whatever it is, right? Or potentially gold, you kind of have an unlimited power of the economy. Now, the downside of that is over time, your money is devalued, right? But your expansion is not limited to one finite thing. And so I think that needs to be said here, because I think that sometimes it can come across as like it's a bad thing or something like that. And it's like, well, when you look to the other side, you're very limited.
That's when I first learned the principle that when central banks print a lot of money to relieve a crisis, buy stocks, gold, and commodities, because their value will rise and the value of paper money will fall. This printing of money is also what happened in 2008 to relieve the mortgage-driven debt crisis. And in 2020, to relieve the pandemic-driven economic crisis, and it almost certainly will happen in the future. So I suggest that you keep this principle in mind. These experiences gave me another principle, which is to understand what is coming at you, you need to understand what happened before you. That principle led me to study how the Roaring Twenties bubble turned into the 1930s depression, which gave me the lessons that allowed me to anticipate and profit from the 2007 bubble turning into the 2008 bust. All these experiences led me to develop an almost instinctual urge to look to the past for similar situations to learn how to handle the future well. Changing orders.
You know what's going to happen next time? Next time, they're going to print a ton of money and stock market's not going to go up just to mess with everybody's mind and like, wait, you said buy stocks, buy gold, buy commodities when they print the money, man, and they didn't go up. Just wait, okay? Just wait. The stock market will always do whatever you expect it not to do, essentially. Okay?
Over the last few years, three big things that hadn't happened in my lifetime prompted me to do this study. First, countries didn't have enough money to pay their debts, even after lowering interest rates to zero. So their central banks began printing lots of money to do so. Second, big internal conflicts emerged due to growing gaps in wealth and values. This showed up in political populism and polarization between the left, who want to redistribute wealth, and the right, who want to defend those holding the wealth. And third, increasing external conflict between a rising great power and the leading great power, as is now happening with China and the United States. So I looked back. I saw that all these had happened together before.
I gotta say, man, they push it a little bit on these illustrations. They make it look like the United States is like falling off. Like, oh, the United States falling up and China's so great. They're coming up here. No, it's not the... Whatever, man.
And nearly always led to changing domestic and world orders. The last time this sequence happened was from 1930 to 1945. What exactly is an order, you might ask? It's a governing system for people dealing with each other. There are internal orders for governing within countries, typically laid out in constitutions. And there is a world order for governing between countries, typically laid out in treaties. Internal orders change at different times than world orders, though whether within or between countries, these orders typically change after wars. Civil wars within countries, international wars between countries. They happen when revolutionary new forces defeat weak old orders. For example, the U.S. internal order was laid out in the Constitution in 1789 after the American Revolution, and it is still operating today, even after the American Civil War. Russia got rid of its old order and established a new one with the Russian Revolution in 1917, which ended in 1991 with a relatively bloodless revolution. China began its current internal order in 1949 when the Chinese Communist Party won the Civil War. You get the idea. The current world order, commonly called the American world order, formed after the Allied victory in World War II, when the U.S. emerged as the dominant world power. It was set out in agreements and treaties for how global governance and monetary systems work. In 1944, the New World...
It was a huge advantage, the fact that obviously World War II didn't happen on U.S. soil, so Obviously, that war was, mainly fought in Europe, and much of Europe was destroyed. So U.S., was already in a really good position, kind of going into World War II. And when everybody else is pretty much destroyed, you emerge.
Monetary system was laid out in the Bretton Woods Agreement and established the dollar as the world's leading reserve currency. A reserve currency is a currency that is commonly accepted around the world, and having one is a key factor in a country becoming the richest and most powerful empire. With a new dominant power and monetary system established, a new world order begins. These changes take place in a timeless and universal cycle that I call the Big Cycle. I'll start with a quick overview, then give you a more complete version, and then direct you to my book if you want more. As I studied the 10 most powerful empires over the last 500 years and the last 3 reserve currencies, it took me through the rise and decline of the Dutch Empire and the guilder, the British Empire and the pound, the rise and early decline in the United States Empire and the dollar, and the decline and rise of the Chinese Empire and its currencies, as well as the rise and decline of the Spanish, German, French, Indian, Japanese, Russian, and Ottoman empires, along with their significant conflicts, as measured in this chart. To understand China's patterns better, I also studied the rise and fall of Chinese dynasties and their monies back to the year 600. Because looking at all these measures at once can be confusing, I'll focus on the 4 most important ones: the Dutch, British, US, and Chinese. You'll quickly notice the pattern. Now let's simplify the form a bit. As you can see, they transpired in overlapping cycles that lasted about 250 years, with 10 to 20-year transition periods between them. Typically, these transitions have been periods of great conflict because leading powers don't decline without a fight. So how am I measuring an empire's power?
All the world better hope for is that we don't ever go down. Because you want to see a fight with us, man. The whole world is going to blow up. That's all I got to say about that. I don't think they know what we got over here.
In this study, I used 8 metrics. Each country's measure of total power is derived by averaging them together. They are education, inventiveness and technology development, competitiveness in global markets, economic output, share of world trade, military strength, the power of their financial center for capital markets, and the strength of their currency as a reserve currency. Because these powers are measurable, we can see how strong each country is now, was in the past, and whether they're rising or declining.
I think this is important. Okay, so he's got this up here.
By examining.
So if we were to look at all these that Ray Dalio has up here. Education, lower education, I definitely don't think the United States has the best. Higher education, we're number 1 by a mile. There's a reason that, all these people from foreign countries that have money, where do they send their kids to college in the United States? So we have it as far as higher education. Innovation technology, it's us by a mile and then the rest of the world. Competitiveness, us by a mile in the rest of the world. Output, depends on how you measure that. So that could be, trade, I think that depends on many various factors. Like what type of trade are you talking about? Are you talking about like, making washer machines and dryers? Or are you talking about like, what tech companies are running the world? Because the United States tech companies, we run the whole world. That's why we have all the $1 trillion, type companies over here. Military, it's us by a mile. After this Russia situation, I'm really seeing how dominant we are. Financial center, us by a mile. Reserve status, obviously us by a mile. And military, once again, is us by a mile. So, I don't want to throw some water on the flames here, but I think we're in a pretty good position.
Sequences from many countries, we can see how a typical cycle transpires.
I like how videos like this kind of keep us on our toes, you know, a little bit. Like, oh, you know, maybe we could fall off, you know, maybe we...
And because the wiggles can be confusing, we can simplify it a bit to focus on the pattern of cause-effect relationships that drive the rise and decline of a typical empire. As you can see, better education typically leads to increased innovation and technology development, and with a lag, the establishment of the currency as a reserve currency. You can also see that these forces then declined in a similar order, reinforcing each other's decline. Let's now look at the typical sequence of events going on inside a country that produces these rises and declines. In a nutshell, the big cycle typically begins after a major conflict, often a war, establishes the new leading power and the new world order. Because no one wants to challenge this power, a period of peace and prosperity typically follows. As people get used to this peace and prosperity, they increasingly bet on it continuing. They borrow money to do that, which eventually leads to a financial bubble. The empire's share of trade grows, and when most transactions are conducted in its currency, it becomes a reserve currency, which leads to even more borrowing. At the same time, this increased prosperity distributes wealth unevenly, so the wealth gap typically grows between the rich haves and the poor have-nots. Eventually, the financial bubble bursts, which leads to the printing of money and increased internal conflict between the rich and the poor, which leads to some form of revolution to redistribute wealth. This can happen peacefully or as a civil war. While the empire struggles with this internal conflict, its power diminishes relative to external rival powers on the rise. When a new rising power gets strong enough to compete with the dominant power that is having domestic breakdowns, external conflicts, most typically wars, take place. Out of these internal and external wars come new winners and losers. Then the winners get together to create the new world order, and the cycle begins again. As I looked back...
See how Ray Dalio just had China just overlap U.S., and then U.S. isn't even in there. Dang, man, we got forgotten about. Shoot!
Saw that these cause and effect relationships drove the cycles of rises and declines all the way back to the Roman Empire. I saw how the stories of each one of these cycles blended together with others before, during, and after, in the same way as each individual story blends with others to make the epic 500-year story that is our collective.
By the way, I thought it was worth mentioning China holds the second most U.S. debt. So, you know, as much as I know it's fun to kind of play against like China versus U.S. and things like that, both countries are actually really kind of relying on each other in many various ways. And I mean many various ways.
History. And like human life cycles, no two are exactly the same, but most are similar. They're driven by logical cause and effect relationships that progress through stages from birth to strength and maturity to weakness and inevitably decline. However, that's like saying a person's life cycle takes 80 years on average without recognizing that many are much shorter and many are longer. While age can be a good indicator of future longevity, a better way is to look at health indicators. One can do that with empires and their vital signs too. I found that by watching the indicators of power change, I was able to see what stage a country was in, which helped me to anticipate what was likely to come next. Now, I'll take you through the big cycle in more detail. Give me 20 minutes and I'll give you the last 500 years of history and show you the similar patterns across the Dutch, British, U.S., and Chinese empires.
Got you, Ray.
500 years of big cycles. I'm going to describe the typical cycle by dividing it into 3 phases. the rise, the top, and the decline. The rise. Successful new orders that rise, both internal and external, are typically started by powerful revolutionary leaders doing four things. First, they win power by gaining more support than the opposition. Second, they consolidate power by converting, weakening, or eliminating the opposition so they don't stand in their way. Third, they establish systems and institutions that make the country work well. And fourth, they pick their successors well, or create systems that do that. Because a great empire requires many great leaders over several generations. At this stage, soon after winning the fight, there is typically a period of peace and growing prosperity because the leadership is clearly dominant and has broad support, so no one wants to fight it. During this phase, leaders within the country have to design an excellent system to raise the country's wealth and power. First and foremost, to be great, they must have strong education, which is not just teaching knowledge and skills, but also strong character, civility, and work ethic. These are typically taught in the family, schools, and religious institutions. That provides a healthy respect for rules and laws, order within society, low corruption, and enables them to unite behind a common purpose and work well together. As they do this, they increasingly shift from producing basic products to innovating and inventing new technologies. For example, the Dutch rose to defeat the Habsburg Empire and become superbly educated. They became so inventive that they came up with a quarter of all major inventions in the world, the most important of which was the invention of ships that could travel around the world to collect great riches. And
that's crazy to think about, like how far we've come as, humans, let's say human race, over the past 300-400 years. The fact that like just a simple wooden ship is like a massive deal, right? A few hundred years ago, it's extraordinary when you think about like just the progress we have made. Just incredible. But yeah, I'm sure coming out with boats or ships, that was like a huge deal at that time, and be able to transport. I mean, yeah, I don't think it gets much more innovative than that, at least back then.
Capitalism, as we know it today, to finance those voyages. They, like all leading empires, enhance their thinking by being open to the best thinking in the world. As a result, the people in the country become more productive and more competitive in world markets, which shows up in their growing economic output and rising share of world trade. You can see this happening now as the U.S. and China are roughly comparable in both their economic outputs and their shares of world trade. As countries trade more globally, they must protect their trade routes and their foreign interests from attack, so they develop great military strength. If done well, this virtuous cycle leads to strong income growth, which can be used to finance investments in education, infrastructure, and research and development. They must also develop systems to incentivize and empower those that have the ability to make or take wealth. In all of these cases, the most successful empires used a capitalist approach to develop productive entrepreneurs. Even China, which is run by the Chinese Communist Party, used a form of this capitalist approach.
What never gets enough credit is the system. I know Warren Buffett said this. He's like, if I was born, a few hundred years ago, in a jungle or something, my skills wouldn't have been worth anything, right? And the same is, you could say that for everybody on the billionaire list. They're products of the system we're in right now that allows you that ability to create tons of jobs and own businesses and create tremendous amounts of wealth for yourself and for other investors that invest in whatever your projects are doing and those sorts of things, right? And all the indirect jobs that come from those giant corporations, the Amazons, the Teslas, the Berkshire Hathaways, Apples, and Microsofts, and all those companies, right? So you need the system in place, because without the system, There is no Elon Musk. There is no Jeff Bezos. There is no Warren Buffett. There is no Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and those folks, right?
Deng Xiaoping, when asked about this, said, "It doesn't matter if it's a white cat or a black cat, as long as it catches mice. And it's glorious to be rich." To do this well, they must develop their capital markets. Most importantly, their lending, bond, and stock markets. That allows people to convert their savings into investments to fund invention and development.
So in terms of the, China, because obviously a lot of this is flirting with the idea of China overtaking the U.S. and really becoming the world power, right? I can tell you the Chinese stock market is not really the place, right? U.S. investors don't want it. Most European investors don't even want it. A lot of Chinese investors much would prefer to invest in the U.S. markets and do either legally or through, let's just call it back doors, okay? So that's a big weakness that comes with the Chinese system, the distrust, specifically in relation to stocks, in the way the Chinese government views their corporations. I mean, investors don't even feel safe investing in Alibaba. Alibaba is the biggest, most dominant company in China. And investors don't even feel safe investing in it because of how much distrust the Chinese government, puts out there in relation to investing in stocks. And so if China ever really wants to, potentially take that mantle from us in the U.S., right? They got a lot of work to do on the stock market side, I can tell you that, and just in the overall financial market space. Big
and
time.
Share in the successes of those who make great things happen.
Even in the Evergrande, there's a lot of distrust on like what really is going on there, what's the truth, what's the government hiding, and things like that, right?
Created the first publicly listed company, the Dutch East India Company,
and
the first stock market to fund it, which were integral parts of the system that produced massive wealth and power. As a natural consequence, the greatest empires developed the world's leading financial centers for attracting and distributing the world's capital. Amsterdam was the world's financial center when the Dutch were preeminent. London, when the British were on top. New York is now. And China is quickly developing its financial centers. Most importantly, the capitalists, the governments...
Just so we know, it's more than just big, tall buildings. It's more
than the military must work together. Not only did the Dutch work well together, they were one and the same. The Dutch East India Company was granted a trade monopoly from the government and had its own officially sanctioned military to go out into the global markets to make and take wealth. The British followed with the British East India Company and had a similar coordination of their government, business, and military operations. The U.S. military-industrial complex followed suit, as does the Chinese system today. As the country becomes the largest international trading empire, its transactions can be paid with its currency, making it the preferred global medium of exchange. And because their currency is so widely accepted and frequently used, people around the world want to save in it, making it the preferred storehold of wealth, and thus the world's leading reserve currency. The guilder was the world's main reserve currency when the Dutch led world trade, the pound was when the British led, and the dollar has been since the U.S. led. Naturally, China's currency is increasingly being used as a reserve currency. Having a reserve currency enables the empire to borrow more than other countries. That advantage is huge. Think about it. People all over the world are eager to save and hence lend back their currency to the empire.
I don't know anybody that keeps their money in the yuan, okay? To be fair, as China's economy grows and grows and grows and they pump more money out there, guess what? There's going to be more, folks holding money. There's 1.3 billion people over there. So as the Chinese economy gets bigger, it's natural that there should be more and more folks that hold, obviously, Chinese currency. But in order to be the reserve currency around the world, you know, you got to have all the other countries want to be in that currency. And like I said, you know, I know way too many rich people, and I don't know one that's like, I got to put my money in the Chinese currency. It's not the way this works. And unless that changes anytime soon,
countries without a reserve currency don't have that. And when the empire runs out of its own money, remember the United States in 1971? They can always print more. The exorbitant privilege afforded by the empire's reserve currency leads borrowing to increase and the beginning of a financial bubble. This series of cause and effect relationships leading to mutually...
By the way, just so everybody's clear, since like the last 400 years, we've been in a financial bubble, okay? We'll always be in a financial bubble. There will never not be a financial bubble. And even when stocks crash or real estate crash or anything, there'll still be, we're in a bubble, right? We're always in a bubble. We always will be in a bubble. That's just the way it works.
Financial, political, and military powers.
As long as you have debt, technically you're in a bubble.
Bolstered by the borrowing power of a reserve currency, have gone together since history began to be recorded. All the empires that became the most powerful in the world followed this path to the top. While in the top phase, most of these strengths are sustained, embedded within the fruits of their success are the seeds of their decline. As a rule, as people in these rich and powerful countries earn more, that makes them more expensive and less competitive relative to people in other countries who are willing to work for less. At the same time, people in other countries naturally copy the methods and technologies of the leading power, which further reduces the leading power's competitiveness. For example, British shipbuilders had less expensive workers than Dutch shipbuilders. So they hired Dutch designers to design better ships that were built by less expensive British workers, making them more competitive, which led the British to rise and the Dutch to decline. Also, as people become rich...
The Dutch could have stayed on top if they just increased their population massively and kept attracting the best people and kept out innovating everybody else. If you're going to just try to do the same thing over and over, you will always lose. And that's the whole key to this. The whole key, let me just break it down. Real simple for everybody, okay? The whole key to the United States always staying on top, I'll tell you what it is, outside of the military, okay? Outside of that, stay innovative and keep the best companies. If the United States was just an economy that was just trying to produce jeans and clothing and textile stuff, guess what? That stuff moved offshore a long time ago because you can get people to do that for way cheaper in other countries, right? So you will always lose that game. You have to continue to innovate, come out with new industries, come out with new sectors, do different stuff than everybody else is doing that they don't even have the capability of doing. That's how you always stay ahead in this game. And if you look at, why the United States is in such a great position today in 2022, who's running the world? Apple's running the world. Microsoft's running the world. Amazon's running the world, right? Facebook's running the world. Tesla's going to be running the world, right? These sorts of companies are the ones that run the world. Adobe, Oracle, all these beasts, NVIDIA, AMD, they're all US, right? And these are the most important companies nowadays. And so that's how you stay on top. The moment United States gets passed up there, that's when we're in some real struggle. But that's not happening today. That's not happening tomorrow. That's not happening next year. It's not happening in 5 years. It's not happening in 10 years. 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, who knows? Maybe it's a whole different game we're talking about. And we lose that innovation, that competitive edge. And companies are just out competing us, and their companies are becoming way bigger beasts than our companies. But as of today, we have the dominant companies, and that's why we're running the world.
They tend not to work as hard. They enjoy more leisure, pursue the finer and less productive things in life, and at the extreme become decadent. Values change from generation to generation during the rise to the top.
First off, all the rich people I know freaking work like ridiculous, like putting crazy hours. And so, maybe if you just give all your money to your kids or something like that, they're maybe the ones that will just sit around on a yacht all day and just do nothing. But if anything, I think most rich people actually don't even really get to enjoy their money the way that you would think they'd get to enjoy because they're so busy working all the time. It's just, that's the way it is. How do you think they got there? They didn't get there by magic, got there from grinding.
Who had to fight to achieve wealth and power to those who inherited it. They're less battle-hardened, steeped in luxuries, and accustomed to the easy life, which makes them more vulnerable to challenges. The golden era of the Dutch Empire and the Victorian era of the British Empire were such high prosperity periods like this. As people get used to doing well, they increasingly bet on the good times continuing and borrow money to do that, which grows into financial bubbles. Naturally, the financial gains come up.
You ever seen that video before where Shaq says, "Oh, my kid said, oh, we're rich, right, Dad?" He said, "No, I'm rich. You're not rich. I'm rich." I like that.
Evenly, so the wealth gap grows. Wealth gaps are self-reinforcing because rich people use their greater resources to reinforce their powers. For example, they give greater privileges to their children, like better education, and they influence the political system to their advantage. This causes the gaps in values, politics, and opportunities to grow between the rich haves and the poor have-nots. Those who are less well off feel the system is unfair, so resentments grow. But as long as the living standards of most people are still rising, these gaps and resentments don't boil over into conflict. Having the world's reserve currency inevitably leads to borrowing excessively and contributes to the country building up large debts with foreign lenders. While this boosts spending power over the short term, it weakens the country's financial health and weakens the currency over the long term. In other words, when borrowing and spending are strong, the empire appears very strong, but its finances are in fact being weakened. The borrowing sustains the country's power beyond its fundamentals by financing both domestic overconsumption and international military conflicts required to maintain the empire. Inevitably, the cost of maintaining and defending the empire becomes greater than the revenue it brings in, so having an empire becomes unprofitable. For example, the Dutch Empire overextended around the world and fought war after increasingly expensive war with the British and other European powers to protect its territory and trade routes. The British Empire similarly became massive, bureaucratic, and lost its competitive advantages as rival powers, particularly Germany, soared, leading to an increasingly expensive arms race and world war. The U.S. has spent about $8 trillion on foreign wars and their consequences since September 11, and trillions more for other military operations and for supporting military bases in 70 countries. And it still isn't spending enough to support its military competition with China in the area around China. In this cycle, the richer countries eventually get deeper into debt by borrowing from poorer countries that save more. It's one of the early signs of a wealth and power shift. This started in the United States.
I'll be honest, I love a lot of this video, and there's some great points and some great fundamental points, but, it does seem, it kind of reminds me of watching, like a what is supposed to be a true story movie, right? And it's like there's a lot of truth in it, and like that was accurate. Like that's how it actually happened. Like for instance, like The Social Network is one of my favorite movies all time. Great movie, right? There was some stuff that was obviously like fabricated or kind of like pushed, and it really didn't go down like that, but it made the story a little better. And I feel like this video, there's a ton of truth in here, but there's like this little like fabrications here and there of like over exaggerating certain elements. That's all I'll say.
In the 1980s, when it had a per capita income 40 times that of China's, and started borrowing from Chinese who wanted to save in dollars because the dollar was the world's reserve currency. Similarly, the British borrowed a lot of money from its much poorer colonies, and the Dutch did the same at their time. If the empire begins to run out of new lenders, those holding their currency begin to look to sell and get out rather than to buy, save, lend, and get in. And the strength of the empire begins to decline. The decline. The decline comes from internal economic weakness together with internal fighting or costly external fighting or both. Typically, the decline comes gradually and then very suddenly. When debts become very large and there is an economic downturn and the empire can no longer borrow the money necessary to repay its debts, the financial bubble bursts. This creates great domestic hardships and forces the country to choose between defaulting on its debts or printing a lot of new money. It always chooses to print a lot of new money. At first gradually, and eventually massively. That devalues the currency and raises inflation. For the Dutch, this was the financial crisis brought about by financial excesses and paying for the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War. Similarly, for the British, it was paying for its financial excesses and its debts from the two world wars. And for the U.S., it's been 3 cycles of debt finance booms and busts since the 90s, with the central bank stepping in each time with stronger measures. When the government has problems funding it.
To be fair, in this latest one, why did they have to step up like that? Well, dude, you had like unemployment skyrocket to 20-something%. The government, basically made it so a lot of businesses had to shut down completely. My main house is in Las Vegas. The whole strip closed for 2 flipping flapjacking months. The whole thing. If the government's going to force you to shut down everything, right? You better get the printing press ready because there's a lot of jobs out there that was just gone overnight, right? And so, it's like, it is what it is, but I think it's not because we got in that place because we were doing something wrong prior to that. It's just we had a once in a 100-year pandemic. The government decided to take certain steps, which was basically shut down the whole economy for certain periods of time. And, that's the only way you could have got through that situation.
When there are bad economic conditions and living standards for most people are declining, and there are large wealth, values, and political gaps, internal conflict between the rich and the poor, as well as different ethnic, religious, and racial groups, greatly increases. This leads to political extremism that shows up as populism of the left or the right. Those of the left seek to redistribute the wealth, while those of the right seek to maintain the wealth in the hands of the rich. Typically, during such times, taxes on the rich rise, and when the rich fear their wealth and well-being will be taken away, they move to places, assets, and currencies they feel safer in. These outflows reduce the empire's tax
Monaco, here I come, baby.
Which leads to a classic, self-reinforcing, hollowing out process. When the flight of wealth gets bad enough, governments outlaw it. Those seeking to get out begin to panic. These turbulent conditions undermine productivity, which shrinks the economic pie and causes more conflict about how to divide the shrinking resources. Populist leaders emerge from both sides and pledge to take control and bring about order. That's when democracy is most challenged because it fails to control the anarchy. And it is when the move to a strong populist leader who will bring order to the chaos is most likely. As conflict within the country escalates, it leads to some form of revolution or civil war to redistribute wealth and force the necessary big changes. This can be peaceful and maintain the existing order, but it's more often violent and changes the order. For example, the Roosevelt Revolution to redistribute wealth was relatively peaceful and maintained the existing internal order. while the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and the Chinese Revolution were much more violent and led to new internal orders. This internal conflict makes the empire weak and vulnerable to rising external rivals who, seeing this domestic weakness, are more inclined to mount a challenge. This raises the risk of great international conflict, especially if the rival has built up a comparable military. Defending oneself and one's empire against rivals requires great military spending, which has to occur as domestic economic conditions are deteriorating and the empire can least afford it. Since there is no viable system for peacefully adjudicating international disputes, these conflicts are typically resolved through tests of power. As bolder challenges are made, the leading empire is faced with the difficult choice of fighting or retreating. Fighting and losing is the worst outcome. But retreating is bad too, as it cedes progress to the rival and signals that the empire is weak to those countries that are considering which side to be on. Poor economic conditions cause more fighting for wealth and power, which inevitably leads to some kind of war. Wars are terribly costly. At the same time, they produce the tectonic shifts that realign the new orders to the new realities of wealth and power in the world. When those holding the reserve currency and debt of the declining empire lose faith and sell them, that marks the end of its big cycle. Of the roughly 750 currencies that existed since 1700, less than 20% now exist, and all of them have been devalued. For the Dutch, this happened after their defeat in the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, when they weren't able to repay the massive debts they built up during it. This led to a run on the Bank of Amsterdam and a desperate sell-off, forcing massive money printing, which devalued the currency and the empire into irrelevance. For the British, this happened after World War II, when despite their victory, they could not repay the massive debts they borrowed to fund their war effort. This led to a series of money printing, devaluations, and sell-offs in the British pound as the US and the dollar emerged dominant and created a new world order. At the time of this recording, the United States hasn't yet reached this point. While it has massive debt, it spends more than it earns, and funds this deficit with more borrowing and printing huge amounts of new money, the big sell-off in dollars and dollar debt hasn't yet begun. And while there are...
Just so we're clear, every other country does that as well. Just want to make that crystal clear. The United States is not the only country that does that. Every single country does that.
Internal and external conflicts occurring for all the classic reasons, they've not yet crossed the line to become wars. Eventually, out of these conflicts, whether they're violent or not, come new winners who get together and restructure the losers' debts and political systems and establish the new world order. Then, the old cycle and empire ends, and the new one begins, and they do it all over again. That's a lot of detail I just threw at you to paint a picture of how the typical big cycle transpires. Of course, not all of them transpire in exactly this way, but most largely do. So much so that it seems like the stories of rises and declines stay essentially the same, and the only things that change are the clothes the characters wear and the technologies they use. So, where are we heading? The future. Most empires have their time in the sun and inevitably decline. Reversing a decline is difficult because that requires undoing a lot that's already been done, but it's possible. By looking at these indicators, it's pretty easy to see which stage of the big cycle an empire is in, how fit it is, and whether its condition is improving or worsening, which can help one estimate how many years it has left. Still, these estimates aren't precise, and the cycle can be extended if those in charge pay attention to their vital signs and improve them. For example, knowing that a person is 60 years old, how fit they are, whether they smoke or not, and a few other basic vital signs, one can estimate the person's longevity. One can do that with empires and their vital signs too. It won't be precise, but it will be broadly indicative and give clear direction on steps to take to increase longevity. It's most often the case that a nation's greatest war is with itself over whether or not it can make the hard decisions needed to sustain success. As for what we need to do,
it's Twitter. You ever been on Twitter before? It's like a war zone all the time on there, man.
It comes down to just two things: earn more than we spend and treat each other well. All other things I mentioned, strong education, inventiveness, being competitive, and all the rest, are just ways of getting at these two things. It's easy to measure if we're doing them. So like people who want to get fit, let's get on the program and improve our vitals. Let's do that individually and collectively. My goal for sharing this picture of how the world works and a few principles for dealing with it well is to help you recognize where we are and the challenges we face, and to make the wise decisions needed to navigate these times well. Since there is a lot more to discuss and we are out of time, you can...
Ray Dalio, technically we weren't out of time. You could have kept going there, baby, but it's all good. So anyways, whoa, what happened here? What in the world what? That was weird. Let me make this big again. I don't know if that showed up for you guys like that. That was strange. But anyways, that was a really good video. I really enjoyed it. Like I said, it's obviously pushing a narrative of like China is overtaking the U.S. and those sorts of things. And I think this needs to be said, okay? You know, if I had my way, is China strong or China weak? I want a strong China. No doubt about it. If China's strong, in their economy strong, right? There's a lot more money that can come over to the United States, because that money's going to come to the United States. A lot more people to buy real estate in the Chinese in the U.S., right? To buy stocks in the U.S., to buy potentially bonds, to buy government debt, right? To buy iPhones, to buy Starbucks Frappuccinos, to buy Big Macs, right? So at the end of the day, like, I would much rather have a strong China. So I think it's, I know there's always this fascination with putting China against the U.S. and China's got to take over the U.S. and all this stuff. But at the end of the day, we're actually both very reliant on each other. And I prefer a strong China to a weak China. If China was just, everybody was in poverty, a lot of companies would not be having the type of earnings they have. They have those sorts of earnings because China's there as a pretty strong place. And I think that needs to be said. I would rather have, if Russia's economy was super strong and, we were all able to get along, that would be a good thing for the United States at the end of the day. Unfortunately, that's not the way it is, right? But that would be a good thing. It's 140 something million people that live over there, right? If they had a strong economy and they got along great with the rest of the world, that would be a good thing for everybody. And so the worse off other people do, the worse off we do, right? Let's even look at the United States, right? I'd much rather have, everybody doing great in the United States and have a lot of money, because that's a lot more money they could spend on at businesses and those sorts of things, right? So I think it's, a kind of a naive perspective that sometimes folks have, where they think it's like one has to win and one loses. When in fact, if you have a bunch of people winning, then you're going to be able to win a lot more. If imagine you live in a town, right? And you're the only one in that whole town who has any money, and you can't spend money outside of that town or whatever, and the other 9 people are broke. What are you going to do? You're that's no fun, because it's like, how are you going to even sell them stuff if they don't have any money to buy your products or whatever? And then you're poor as well, right? And so then everybody's poor. So at the end of the day, I'd rather have everybody strong, everybody gets along, and we can all prosper. And the worse other people do, the worse off we do. That's just the way it works. So anyways, guys, hope you enjoyed this video. As always, let me know what you think about Ray Dalio's video there. I appreciated it. Thought it was a cool reaction. Fun to watch it with you guys. Much love. Don't forget to subscribe. Get some free stocks from Moo. Pin comment down there while you still can, and have a great day.